Good day, all. This talk will examine the history and basic ideas of Marxism. Marxism, of course, begins with the work of Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883. And in this talk, I shall explain Marx's main theories and theoretical concepts, because they still form the basis for this approach. To begin with, Marx never called his theory Marxism. Other people did that. He called his theory Materialism, because he focused on the material or objective side of society. Like many other theorists, Marx wanted to understand the relationship between the objective and subjective sides of society. Marx started out as a student of philosophy in Germany, but his problem was that he disagreed with the prevailing philosophical approach of his time, which was called idealism. Idealism focused on the subjective and argued that ideas are the driving force of history, and that history is all about the development of the human consciousness and humanity gradually coming to understand itself and the universe. Idealism was one of the philosophical roots of the sociological tradition of subjectivism. But Marx argued that idealism was an academic's ivory tower theory. Sure, for academics, life is all about ideas, but most people have more practical concerns, like making a living. So, Marx switched from philosophy to political economy. Back then, politics and economics were taught together, on the grounds that you can't understand one without the other, which I, like most sociologists, would totally agree with. Indeed, Marxism or materialism is still sometimes referred to as a political economy approach. Marx argued that for every individual and every society, their number one priority has to be survival. If you don't survive, nothing else matters. And, said Marx, we ensure our survival primarily through the economy. It is through the economy that we provide ourselves with food and shelter and all the material necessities of life. This is why for Marx the economy is the most important aspect of society, and everything else in society has to fit in to the economy. This means that the subjective side of society has to fit into the objective or material side. So Marx divided up society into its base and its superstructure. Society's base is its economy, and on top of that, society builds its superstructure, which is its culture. Essentially, this is a division between the objective and subjective sides of society. The economy meets our objective needs for food, shelter, and so on, while culture comprises the entire subjective side of society: art, religion, science, politics, and so on. For Marx, society's subjective culture always has to build on top of and fit into society's objective economic structure. In other words, the economy establishes the basic social structures and the basic way of thought of society as a whole. For Marx, consciousness is a social product. Marx said, consciousness does not determine being. Being determines consciousness. In other words, how we live and work in society shapes how we think. Marx argued that because we have to work to survive, human reason has never been abstract, but always practical. Early humans did not develop language and rational thought so that they could sit around the campfire and swap stories. they developed language and reason to help them communicate. And they needed to communicate so that they could cooperate. And they had to cooperate so that they could survive. Individually, human beings are no big deal in the animal kingdom. There are plenty of animals out there that are bigger and stronger and that one-on-one will have us for lunch. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But human beings can communicate and cooperate much better than any other species. And it is by cooperating and working together in society that humanity has become the dominant species on this planet. However, said Marx, once society grew beyond small tribes into large agricultural societies, the economy also became the basis for growing social inequality. In particular, society became divided up into two main classes, the ruling class and the ruled class. The ruling class are a rich, powerful minority who control society because they control the economy. The ruled class are the majority, who work for the ruling class and who are just barely getting by. In addition to these two main classes, Marx said there is also a middle class in between the ruling class and the ruled class, and an underclass below the ruled class, consisting of the poor and the unemployed. However, Marx also said that these classes were relatively small and had little influence on society, so he focused mostly on the two main classes. In agricultural societies, these were the aristocracy and the peasants. In modern industrial society, they're what Marx called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these days more commonly termed the capitalist or business class, and the working class. Classes first emerged in agricultural society, when economics and politics became formalized into the social institutions of property and the state. The ruling class are those who own the property and control the state, the rich and powerful, as I like to call them. If society's dominant property form is state property, as it was, for example, in ancient Egypt and in the Soviet Union, then the state controls the economy, and the same people are both a political and an economic ruling class. But if society's dominant property form is private property, as it is in modern Western society, then there is a formal separation between the rich and the powerful, between capitalists and politicians. But in practice, says Marx, they're just two wings of the same ruling class. They support each other and maintain their mutual rule. But for Marx, property, as the central economic institution, is the most important institution in society, and so the main class division in any society is between those who own the property and those who do not. Private property must also be distinguished from personal property. Personal property consists of your personal possessions, your clothes, your car, your house, and so on. These are all consumer goods, meaning things you buy and use. Private property consists of production goods, or what Marx called the means of production, meaning things that produce consumer goods, such as factories, machinery, mines, and other businesses. The main difference between the two are that production goods make money, while consumption goods do not, and that private property gives the owner power over other people, whereas personal property does not. Owning a big house and a fancy car may be nice for you, but it doesn't give you power over others. But if you own a business, then you're an employer. Other people come and ask you for a job, and you have the power to hire and fire them. You have the power to give them a livelihood or take that livelihood away. So, private property provides wealth and power. Wealth and power go together, which is why Marx didn't call them the rich class. He called them the ruling class. In more formal terms, private property gives its owner two legal rights: domination and exploitation, which translate into power and wealth. Domination is the right to give orders and have them obeyed. This domination begins in the economy. The boss gives the orders, and the workers do as they're told, or they get fired. But this domination also extends into politics, because in politics, money talks. In modern democracies, to get elected to political office, you have to run an election campaign. But election campaigns cost a lot of money. So, the only people who can afford them are either rich people, like Donald Trump, or politicians who have got money from rich people. The problem is that when the rich contribute to a politician's campaign fund, they expect something in return, a quid pro quo, or you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I gave you a $10,000 campaign contribution that got you elected. Now you give me $1 million tax cut or a $10 million government contract. Marx argued that in this way, wealthy capitalists essentially hire politicians to run the government in much the same way that they hire management to run their corporations. So, the capitalist class exercises its domination in both economics and politics. Private property also gives the right of exploitation. This has been given many different definitions. The definition I'm going to give you is that exploitation is the right to not pay workers the full value of their work. Marx believed in the labor theory of value, which simply says that the value of anything depends on how much labor has been put into it. The more work you put into something, the more it's worth. So to explain exploitation, let's say, just keeping the numbers simple here, that in 1 week, one worker makes $1,000 worth of some product, books, tables, computers, whatever. Is that worker going to get paid $1,000 a week? No, he's not. Let's say he gets $500 a week. Now, on top of the worker's wages, the capitalist, of course, has all kinds of other costs: raw materials, utilities, transport, and so on. But at the end of the day, after the capitalist sells the products for $1,000, there has to be something left over. And that is the capitalist's profit. The profit motive is why businessmen are in business. And if your business is not making a profit, then pretty soon you'll be out of business. The problem, said Marx, is that profit comes from exploiting the workers. The workers did the work. The workers built the products, but the capitalist gets rich off their work. Now, certainly, the capitalist works too, and he deserves to be rewarded for that. But let's say, still keeping the numbers simple, that one capitalist employs 1,000 workers, and that his profit margin on each worker is $100. So, each worker is earning $500 a week, but the capitalist is making $100,000 a week. Most of the work was done by the workers, but most of the money goes to the capitalist. That is why capitalism, like all class-based societies, is fundamentally unfair and unjust, said Marx. In addition to domination and exploitation, private property also creates one other thing: alienation. Alienation is similar to Durkheim's concept of anomie in that both can be defined as separation. But Durkheim only looked at how people got separated from each other. Marx used the concept of alienation much more broadly and argued that private property separated people from a number of things that can be ranged on a spectrum from objective to subjective. Firstly, in objective terms, the workers have been alienated from the means of production. In other words, the things they use in their work, factories, machinery, tools, and so on, all belong to someone else. Now, in early tribal society, before the invention of private property, nature, which was their means of production, was freely available to anyone. Nobody could stop you from hunting or gathering for your dinner. And in agricultural society, as long as the farmer owned his land, he owned his means of production, and he grew his own dinner. But in modern industrial capitalist society, most people have been separated from nature. We can neither farm nor hunt and gather. So, if we want to eat, we gotta get a job. A job from the people who now own the means of production, the capitalists. And of course, that gives the capitalist class enormous power and wealth. Secondly, also in objective terms, the workers are alienated from what Marx called the fruits of their labor, meaning the things they produce. In pre-industrial societies, if you made something, it was yours. If you made a bow or a table, then of course it was yours. You made it. But not anymore. These days, workers make things that don't belong to them. For example, a worker can spend his whole life on an assembly line making Cadillacs, but never in his life own a Cadillac. Even while the worker is physically making the product, he is socially separated from it because it doesn't belong to him. Thirdly, still in objective terms, but in a different way, the workers are alienated from their own labor process, which means how they do their jobs. This is still objective, but now we're no longer talking about things, we're talking about actions. We're talking about what the workers do when they do their job. In pre-industrial societies, most people controlled their own labor process. If you were a farmer, you knew how to farm. Nobody stood there and told you how to farm. But in capitalist society, the boss tells you how to do your job. On an assembly line, you're told, stand here, push that button, pull that lever. You've become alienated from your own body. Your body is going through certain motions, not because you want to, but because you've been told to. Fourth, in subjective terms now, the workers are alienated from each other. This is similar to Durkheim's anomie, but Marx goes further and argues that the capitalists deliberately break up the workers. Marx said that the only thing the capitalists fear is collective action. If one worker tries to stand up to the boss, he'll just get fired. Only if a whole lot of workers get together and stand up together will the boss have to make concessions. That's why workers organize trade unions. But capitalists will try to divide and conquer. For example, the boss may break up the workforce into small groups and tell them that the one group that produces the most will get a big bonus. That way, each little group of workers sees the others as competitors, and they don't all get together, form a trade union, and fight for their collective rights and get better wages for everybody. Fifth and finally, in the most subjective terms, the workers are alienated from their personal human potential. In other words, from their inner selves. Marx believed that every individual had the potential to make their unique, creative contribution to society. But in capitalist society, it's only the middle and upper classes that get to realize their potential. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, business persons, they get to realize their potential. But they're only a minority. Most people in the working class have to do mindless, boring, repetitive jobs in factories or offices, going through the same routine day after day. And as the saying goes, use it or lose it. If you're not allowed to be creative in your daily job, then eventually you lose that creativity. You lose your unique human potential. You lose a big part of yourself. So in short, in these 5 ways, private property creates alienation, which promotes the interests of the capitalist class to the detriment of the working class. All of this means that the institution of property creates a built-in conflict of interests between the ruling class and the ruled class in all class societies. So, wherever there is class structure, there is also class conflict. This is why Marx said, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class conflict." Class conflict can take many forms: strikes, demonstrations, protests, and so on. But the ultimate form of class conflict is revolution. This is why Marx also said that it is not ideas, but revolution that is the driving force of history. Marx was not just an academic. He got involved in the workers' movement of his day and actively promoted a working class revolution. Through his ideas, he wanted to give the workers a revolutionary consciousness. However, it turned out that was not so simple. So Marx tried to understand how the workers thought. Now, I said earlier that according to Marxism, the objective shapes the subjective. Our material circumstances in life shape how we come to think. So, Marx argued that how we think depends, first of all, on the type of society we live in. Marx categorized societies in terms of their mode of production, meaning the type of economy they had. And I shall have more to say about what modes of production Marx identified shortly. But my point for now is that each mode of production creates a particular way of thinking. And that way of thinking only changes when society's economy changes. For example, back in the days of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, their underclass were slaves. Slaves were prisoners of war who were put to work. And at the time, everyone accepted that slavery was a good thing. When Spartacus led a slave revolt out of Rome, as they fought their way out of the city, his men captured Roman soldiers and promptly used them as slave labor as soon as they made camp. In other words, even the slaves believed in slavery, they just didn't want to be slaves themselves. But today, slavery has been abolished. Why? Not because we suddenly became enlightened and realized what a horrible, inhumane, and unjust institution slavery is. No. It's because in industrial society, slavery has become economically obsolete. One skilled worker and a machine can do the work of 100 unskilled slaves. So, as our mode of production has changed, our way of thinking has changed, including our morality. Secondly, within each mode of production, how we think depends primarily on our class position. This is because how you see things depends on where you're looking from. People will generally believe whatever is in their own best class interests to believe. This is why, for example, we still have industrial capitalists who continue to deny that global warming exists, even though the scientists have proven it. Because if they admit that their factories are causing damage to the environment, then they'd have to do something to fix that, which would cost them a lot of money. So it's much easier and much cheaper to just refuse to believe it. Marx also argued that if you bring a lot of workers together, as modern factories do, then over time they should develop a common class consciousness, consisting of an awareness that they're all workers together, that they all share a common class position and common class interests, and a common class enemy in the capitalist class, because the capitalists are dominating and exploiting them all. Creating trade unions is one stage in the development of the workers' class consciousness. But trade unions only fight for workers' economic rights, things like better wages and better work conditions. Marx argued that the workers also had to collectively fight for their political rights. Marx did not believe in democracy. He called it bourgeois democracy, meaning a democracy run by and for the bourgeoisie, the rich capitalists. He believed that in bourgeois democracy, the winner of the election would almost always be the candidate that had the most money to spend on their election campaign, and that would always be the candidate of the rich. In a democracy, the capitalists don't have to win every seat, they just have to win a majority. And Marx believed that they would always spend as much money as they had to make sure that they did. And so in capitalism, the rich would always run the government. This is why Marx said that the only way to get rid of capitalism was through revolution. Marx believed that when the workers attained full class consciousness, they would understand how they were being dominated and exploited by the capitalists, and they would rise up in a revolution and seize control of the state. Once they had control of the government, the workers would change the law so as to abolish private property. For Marx, private property is the root of all evil. Abolish private property, and you get rid of the institutional basis for class inequality, domination, and exploitation. Once you've abolished private property, then you can get rid of the capitalist class and start building a better society. I shall have more to say about Marx's ideas on that later. But for Marx, there was just one problem with all this. The great proletarian revolution hadn't happened because most of the Western working class had not attained class consciousness. On the contrary, they were in a state of false consciousness, meaning they didn't understand where their true class interests lie. For example, working class voters have elected and re-elected right-wing politicians like George Bush or Stephen Harper, even though it can be shown in cold hard dollars and cents that doing so was against their own best interests, because these politicians have lowered taxes on the rich and raised taxes on the rest. During their time in office, the rich grew astronomically richer, while the average person went astronomically into debt. And yet, millions of workers voted for them. The reason that so many workers live in a state of false consciousness, said Marx, is that they've been taken in by the ruling class's ruling ideology. An ideology may be defined as a set of ideas and values which promote the interests of one group or class over those of others. Our society contains various ideologies. Racism is an ideology that promotes the interests of one race or ethnic group over others, usually whites over non-whites. Sexism is an ideology that promotes the interests of one gender over the other, usually men over women. The ruling ideology is an ideology that promotes the interests of the ruling class over the ruled class. The ruling ideology is what persuades workers to go against their own class interests and, for example, vote for right-wing politicians. Marx believed that the ruling ideology had a very strong hold over the ruled class. Indeed, he went so far as to say, the ruling ideas of every society are the ideas of the ruling class. This is because the ruling class controls every single major social institution, and so it uses every institution to spread the ruling ideology. The state, the army, schools, media, churches, and of course, businesses. And because people hear the same pro-capitalist ideas and values coming at them from all sides, most people believe them. Marx spent his whole career with his writings trying to break through the ruling ideology and bring class consciousness to the working class. And, as you can tell from the election of people like Bush and Harper and Donald Trump, he completely failed. Far from wanting to stage a revolution against the capitalists, most people still believe in the capitalists. So, Marx was right the first time. The ruling ideology still rules. The final aspect of Marx's work that I want to examine is his historical model. Marx always based his theories on historical facts. So, Marx spent a lot of time studying history. And as he did so, he came to the conclusion that society had gone through a clear historical process of social evolution. Marx argued that society had evolved through distinct stages, which he termed modes of production or social formations. He argued that even though there have been many thousands of societies in the course of history, they can all be categorized into just a few types of society based on their economies. Since for Marx the economy is the most important aspect of society, social evolution for him primarily means economic evolution. So he sees history as a series of modes of production. Marx broke down the concept of mode of production into the means of production, which Marx also referred to as forces of production and factors of production, and into the relations of production. Forces of production are the objective things that are used in production. Factories, raw materials, machinery, and so on. Relations of production are the subjective relations that people enter into in production, which for Marx primarily meant class relations. Marx argued that the forces and relations of production always have to fit together. So you can't change one without changing both. For example, as long as you only have primitive forces of production, simple tools like picks and shovels, you can use slave relations of production because slaves are the cheapest form of labor. But when technology becomes complex, slavery doesn't work anymore. That's because slaves generally hate their masters and will sabotage the work whenever they think they can get away with it. Now, if they're just digging a ditch or picking cotton, then there's not much they can do. But if you give a slave a complex, delicate piece of technology, first they'll pretend to be too stupid to operate it, and then they'll accidentally break it. You can't have people literally standing over industrial workers with a whip, as you can with slaves. To get people to use high technology, you have to use the carrot, not the stick. You have to give people an incentive to use that technology by paying them. That is why industrial society has relations of production based on wage labor, not slavery. The forces of production, or the technology, changed, so the relations of production, or the class structure, had to change to fit in with them. Historically, the very first mode of production was what Marx called primitive communism. This is what these days is more commonly referred to as hunting and gathering society or foraging society. Marx called it primitive communism because he was categorizing it in terms of its forces and relations of production. It had primitive forces of production, meaning they only had simple tools, and its relations of production were those of a community. The hunting and gathering band was essentially one big family or community in which everyone cared for everyone else. It was a society of equality and sharing. It was a classless society. Social classes did not exist because private property had not yet been invented. There was only personal property, your personal possessions, and there could only be personal property because these societies were nomadic. They didn't build permanent settlements. They just lived in tent cities and moved periodically to ensure their food supply. For example, Plains Indians in North America would follow the buffalo. When the herd moved on to fresh pasture, the tribe just packed up their teepees and moved after them. But the thing was, they didn't have trucks. They didn't even have pack animals. So everything you owned, you literally had to be able to carry on your back. This in itself created a completely different type of culture than we have today. Capitalist culture is all about consumerism. We're constantly bombarded by ads telling us that the most important thing in life is to buy and accumulate as much stuff as possible. So we buy houses and fill them with possessions. In hunting and gathering society, you kept your possessions to a bare minimum, just useful items like tools, weapons, and clothes, because you had to carry them all on your back. So, there could be no rich people because you couldn't accumulate any more wealth than you could carry. There were also no powerful people because there was no power structure. If a decision had to be made that affected the whole band, then the whole band would sit down around the campfire and discuss it. Every adult had the right to speak, and the issue would be discussed until a consensus was arrived at. Now, this was not democracy. There was no voting, no majority rule. Because the problem with majority rule is that it creates unhappy minorities. And there was no room for those in the band. So, you'd keep talking until all objections had been met and there was a unanimous agreement. Then the chief would step forward and declare, in the words of that great Canadian Jeff Probst, "The tribe has spoken." The chief's job, then, was not to make the decision and impose it on the tribe, but only to formalize a decision made by the tribe as a whole. The chief did not rule the tribe like a king. He had no army or police to enforce his decisions. The chief based his social position on status or respect. The chief was the chief because everyone agreed that he was the best person for the job. In a small tribe, everyone gets to know everyone else. Everyone knows who the best hunter is, so he becomes the leader of the hunt. Everyone knows who the best fighter is, so he becomes the war chief, and so on. In tribal societies, there is no wealth and no power. There is only personal property and status. This means that these are societies which do have different social positions, but they do not have social classes. And so they still have both economic and political equality. Primitive communism is by far the longest-lived mode of production. Archaeologists currently estimate that Homo sapiens first evolved in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. And for about the first 190,000 of those years, all human beings lived in hunting and gathering tribes. And of course, some people still do so to this day. But about 11,000 years ago, most of humanity started to make the transition to agricultural society. The reason people did that was not because they'd grown tired of hunting and gathering. Societies, like individuals, only change when they're absolutely forced to. People generally don't like to change because change always involves work and often involves pain. So major change usually only happens when it is literally change or die. And that's what happened to humanity. Humanity was born during a relatively cold period in the Earth's history. So their main food supply consisted of large, furry mammals that had adapted to a cold climate, such as the woolly mammoth and the great elk. But about 15,000 years ago, the Earth entered a phase of global warming. Most of these mammals could not adapt to the warmer climate and went extinct. It seems likely that humanity speeded up their extinction by hunting them, but the main reason they went extinct was climate change. Either way, over a period of a few thousand years, humanity lost its main food supply. Any other species in that situation would also have gone extinct. But, as Marx argued, this is when humanity really distinguished itself from the animals for the first time. Hunter-gatherers do the same thing that animals do to live, they just do it in a more organized way. But when that stopped working, humanity found a new way to survive by doing something that no animal has ever done. We began to cultivate the land. Global warming killed humanity's old food supply, but it also provided the opportunity to create a new food supply through farming. Every ending is a new beginning. Before the global warming, it was too cold to grow crops, and indeed it took thousands of years to get consistently warm enough. But permanent agriculture got going in North Africa about 11,000 years ago. Now, the simplest model of social evolution, which is widely accepted these days, is that society has gone through three main evolutionary stages: hunting and gathering society, agricultural society, and industrial society. Marx's model fits into that, but it's a bit more complex because he identifies several different stages or modes of production in the evolution of agricultural society. The first agricultural mode of production was what he termed the Slavonic mode of production. The reason he called it that was because in his day, the only place it still existed was in the Slavonic countries of East Europe and Russia. But it actually originated, like all the early modes of production, in Africa. The Slavonic mode of production emerged when hunting and gathering bands settled down and began farming small patches of land. Farming changed society from nomadic to sedentary. Once you cleared a patch of land, did all the work needed to get rid of the rocks and the trees, you are not just going to walk away and do it all again somewhere else. No, you became tied to the land. You stopped living in tents and built permanent settlements, farming villages. Now, at first, these villages maintained the egalitarian social structure and traditions of the band. The land was equally divided up, with each family getting its own little patch, and major decisions would still be made by holding a town meeting. However, farming not only replaced foraging, it provided way more food. And that meant two things. First, it meant a population explosion. More food meant more people. Villages grew into towns, which grew into cities, which grew into nations, which grew, sometimes, into empires. And secondly, farming provided food that could be stored, particularly in the form of grain. That meant that wealth could now be accumulated, so that some people could grow rich. And so we saw the rise of social inequality and social classes. Society grew from the Slavonic mode of production into what Marx termed the Asiatic mode of production. Now, just as with the Slavonic mode, Marx called it that because in his day it still existed only in Asia, especially China, but it actually originated in Africa. It was the stage of agricultural empires, and its pinnacle in Africa was ancient Egypt. It was the first class-based mode of production, and it was a stage of extreme social inequality. The ruling class was the aristocracy, who ruled by force of arms, because they controlled the army. The ruled class were the peasant farmers who worked the land. But there also emerged an underclass of slaves. When one army defeated another, the winners took prisoners of war. They could not afford to feed them just to have them sit around, so they put them to work. And so began the institution of slave labor. The slaves became the property of the aristocracy, who were the army officers. The slaves worked for the aristocracy and made them even richer. Slavery, I would argue, was the all-time pinnacle of economic inequality. You cannot get more economically unequal than turning some people into other people's property. At the head of the aristocracy stood the emperor. In ancient Egypt, they called him the pharaoh. And the later pharaohs were an example of another social institution that first emerged in Africa, divine monarchy. The aristocracy, from the very beginning, had the support of the priesthood. As Marx argued, religion has always been a part of the ruling class's ruling ideology. The priests told the people to obey their ruler because he'd been personally chosen by the gods to rule over them. Then later they said that he was actually an avatar of the gods. Then that he was the son of a god. And finally that he was a god. And so the later pharaohs were worshipped as gods. Their word was law. They had absolute power. This is why I would argue that divine monarchy was the all-time pinnacle of political inequality, because there is no higher authority figure than God. The pharaohs could make their people believe that they were gods because they not only controlled the army but also the economy. This meant that they controlled both the means of death and the means of life. They controlled the economy because they controlled the River Nile. Most trade and transport back then had to go by water. Egypt has one coast, the Mediterranean, and one major river, the Nile. So, if you controlled the Nile, you controlled virtually all trade and transport in Egypt. And the pharaohs did control the Nile because Egypt needed a central administration to handle the annual spring flooding of the Nile. If you weren't ready for this flooding, it would be a disaster because your fields would be underwater. But Egypt built a large-scale system of irrigation, which allowed them to turn a disaster into an opportunity by spreading out the water and cultivating a lot more land. Because the pharaohs controlled the irrigation system and so controlled the water supply, this mode of production has also been termed water despotism. The pharaoh was the political ruler, the embodiment of the state. And since he was so powerful, state property was the dominant property form. This meant that when his armies were victorious, the lion's share of the slaves and the booty went to the pharaoh, while the rest of the aristocracy had to divide up what was left. So the pharaoh was by far the richest, as well as the most powerful person in Egypt. And so, in Africa, where the institution of divine monarchy became widespread, state property remained the dominant property form. However, after Egypt, the cutting edge of social evolution moved out of Africa for the first time and into Europe, where private property became the dominant property form. The next mode of production that Marx identified was what he called the ancient mode of production, which meant ancient Greece and ancient Rome. These were agricultural empires, in many ways similar to ancient Egypt, but although the Greek and Roman emperors were powerful, they were never as powerful as the Egyptian pharaohs. The Roman priests tried to persuade the Roman people that their emperors were gods, but the idea never caught on in Europe the way it did in Africa. This was due to geography. Egypt only has one major river, but Greece and Italy are both basically one long coastline filled in with lots of rivers. So it was not possible for the Roman emperor to control the water supply or control trade the way that the Egyptian pharaohs did. This meant that the Roman emperor was more of a first among equals within the aristocracy, and rule was more by the aristocracy as a whole than just by one man. State property became secondary, and private property became the dominant property form. This made Rome a more decentralized form of an empire than Egypt. Unfortunately, it also made it a more militaristic and expansionist empire. When the pharaohs conquered all the lands around Egypt, they turned them into a buffer zone to protect Egypt from attack, and then stopped. They were worshipped as gods in Egypt, so they had all they wanted. But Rome had not just one man's desires to satisfy, the emperors, but those of a whole class of aristocrats, always wanting more booty and more slaves. So Rome kept conquering more and more territory and shipping more and more slaves back to Rome, until eventually the same thing happened to Rome that happens to all agricultural societies which are not first destroyed from outside, namely, the population outgrew the food supply. When that happened, malnutrition, as always, led to plague. From the 4th century on, Rome was ravaged by plagues, and millions died. As a result, the previously unbeatable Roman legions or armies were weakened and defeated by tribes both from Germany and Asia. Rome itself was even looted and burned, and over the 5th and 6th centuries, the Roman Empire collapsed. The result was as if you took one big ornate mirror and shattered it. In place of one grand empire, you suddenly had thousands of mini-empires. Each local warlord who could put together an army conquered a small patch of land and declared himself ruler of it. Since he now owned the land by right of conquest, the peasants had to pay rent to stay on the land, and so warlords became landlords or simply lords. This was the mode of production that Marx called feudalism. Feudalism was also an agricultural society, and so it continued to have a class structure primarily made up of aristocracy and peasants. However, after the collapse of Rome, the institution of slavery gradually died out in Europe, although it took hundreds of years. State property also declined in importance since the central state power was gone, and private property became even more the dominant property form. Feudalism lasted for about 1,000 years, but its main problem was that this was 1,000 years of almost non-stop warfare. This was because every lord wanted to expand his territory by conquering his neighbors. Over time, these thousands of fiefdoms became concentrated into the couple of dozen or so countries or nation states that now make up Europe. But despite killing each other for 1,000 years, by the 14th century, Europe's population had once more outgrown its food supply. Malnutrition and disease became widespread, and bubonic plague, which pretty much finished off the Roman Empire in the 6th century, came back again as what was called the Black Death. In less than a decade, in the mid-14th century, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe died. possibly over 100 million people. That's a very rough estimate because, of course, they didn't keep careful records back then. But after this, some people realized that Europe would have to find a new food supply, or the cycle of malnutrition and plague would just keep repeating. So, beginning in the late 15th century, some Europeans set sail on what have been called the voyages of discovery, such as those of Columbus, Magellan, and Vasco da Gama. These were not really voyages intended to make discoveries. Columbus had no idea he was going to discover America. They were really voyages to establish trade routes. Columbus wanted to establish a trade route to China. He just didn't know that there was this dirty great big continent in the way. These voyages then created intercontinental trade routes, which were the beginning of the creation of the world market. They also marked the beginning of the mode of production we're still living in today, capitalism. Capitalism is a society where the ruling class rules because they own the capital, or the means of production. Factories, machinery, businesses, money. This means that capitalism has a whole new class structure. The aristocracy have been replaced by the bourgeoisie or capitalist class, and the peasants have been replaced by the proletariat or working class. How did that happen? Well, by establishing these international trade routes, Europe's merchant class made itself richer and richer. And in the 18th century, growing international demand led these merchants to turn themselves into true capitalists by establishing factories that could increase production, which in turn prompted people to invent new machinery which could be used in these factories, leading to the Industrial Revolution. Marx argued that capitalism is the first truly dynamic mode of production in world history, because capitalism is the first mode of production that constantly revolutionizes its means of production. In other words, constantly improves its technology. All societies have a market, but capitalism is the first mode of production in which the market has become the most important institution in society. And the market provides capitalists with a constant incentive to develop better technology, so as to, firstly, lower their costs of production, and secondly, invent new gadgets to sell. This is why capitalism has invented far more new technology than all other modes of production put together. So, as Europe industrialized in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, merchants set up factories and became large-scale employers, and so the capitalist class and the working class emerged together. The aristocracy gradually became economically irrelevant and were pushed aside. In France, they refused to go quietly, so they got their heads chopped off by the guillotine in the French Revolution. The British monarchy learned from this and agreed to become just political figureheads in exchange for keeping their heads and their money. So today, King Charles is in theory the ruler of Britain, Canada, and elsewhere. But in practice, the royal family is just a combination soap opera and tourist attraction. Although the state can and does sometimes back up the capitalist class with the army, the capitalists normally rule through the economy rather than through force of arms like the aristocracy. Capitalists usually don't need the army because the power of private property has grown so great that all they really need to rule is money. Money can buy you anything, including politicians and political power. So the ruling class continues to dominate and exploit the ruled class. The capitalists just do it in a different way from the aristocracy. Now, the capitalist economy does not grow smoothly. It grows through the business cycle, also called the boom and bust cycle, in a series of upswings and downswings. Marx believed that as the economy grew, the upswings would get higher, but the downswings, also termed recessions or depressions, would get deeper. Eventually, there would be a depression that would plunge millions of people into unemployment, poverty, and hunger. And that's when the working class would get desperate enough to stage a revolution. They'd seize control of the state and abolish private property. However, said Marx, the capitalists would not just meekly give up their property. They'd fight back. So the workers would have to establish what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat and go through a period of class war. This would be a transition stage, which Marx called socialism. Eventually, Marx believed the workers would win the war and the capitalist class would be destroyed. Then the workers could establish a new, long-lasting mode of production, which Marx called advanced communism. Marx believed that history would come full circle and that we would return to the communal relations of production that we had in early tribal society, only now with advanced forces of production or technology, so that we could support a much bigger population. Marx said that private property would be replaced by what he called socialized property, where everything belonged to everybody, but he never really explained how that was supposed to work. He also said that both the market and the state would disappear, and that society would be run by what he called the free association of direct producers, where the workers simply organized production and distributed goods to everyone on the basis of need, not money. There'd be no classes, so this would be a society of equality, freedom, and justice. However, things did not turn out the way Marx thought they would. First of all, Marx believed that it was always the most advanced society that took the next step in social evolution to the next mode of production. So, he believed that the workers' revolution would take place in the West, especially Western Europe. But that didn't happen. Now, Marx was correct in saying that capitalism's depressions would keep getting worse. And the Great Depression of the 1930s did indeed plunge millions of people into unemployment and poverty. But then capitalism came up with something that Marx did not foresee: the welfare state. Western countries introduced social programs, which made sure that even if people were still poor, they weren't actually starving. And as long as people know where their next meal is coming from, they're not going to risk their lives in a revolution. So, there has been no revolution in the West, and there will not be one in the foreseeable future. However, revolutions did take place in Asia. particularly Russia and China. In both countries, just as Marx predicted, revolutions ushered in a period of civil war, which was ultimately won by the revolutionaries, leading to the overthrow of the old ruling class. Both revolutions were led by communist parties, which claimed to be putting Marx's ideas into practice. In Russia, the Communist Party was led by Vladimir Lenin, who lived from 1870 to 1924, and who became Russia's head of state in October 1917. In addition to being a revolutionary and a politician, Lenin was also a prolific writer. His collected works number over 50 volumes. Not surprisingly, his writings focus on a critique of the state in capitalism and on methods for its revolutionary overthrow. Following Marx, Lenin argued that in capitalism, the state served the interests of the capitalist class, not the common people. Lenin updated Marx with the argument that World War I, in which Europe was then embroiled, was not really a conflict between nations, but a conflict between capitalists. The European empires of the time existed primarily to provide their nations' capitalists with cheap labor and cheap raw materials. Once Europe had conquered the rest of the world, its capitalist classes, supported by their states, inevitably turned on each other in their endless quest to expand their profits. Lenin said that the workers should withdraw from this capitalist war. And it was this position on the war, far more than any other aspect of Marxism, that made Lenin popular among Russian soldiers who were getting slaughtered on the front and who wanted an end to the war. Lenin called on the Communist Party to become what he termed a vanguard for the working class, educating them in Marxist ideas and leading them in revolution. In practice, however, the Communist Party had very little influence on the course of events until October 1917. Then, with the aristocracy already having fled, Lenin and his right-hand man, Leon Trotsky, who lived from 1879 to 1940, led a small group of workers into the mostly abandoned Imperial Palace and declared the communists to be the new rulers of Russia. Of course, it wasn't that easy. The aristocracy fought back, and the civil war between the aristocracy's White Army and the communists' Red Army lasted until 1922. The victorious Red Army was primarily organized by Trotsky. However, once the war was over, Trotsky argued that socialism in one country could not survive, and that instead a permanent revolution was needed until Marx's dream of the global overthrow of capitalism had been accomplished. Over this and other issues, he split from Lenin and then from Stalin, who had him exiled and ultimately assassinated. In China, the Communist Party was led by Mao Zedong, who became known as Chairman Mao. He and the Communists led the Autumn Harvest Uprising of 1927, which led to a civil war which only ended with the Communist victory of 1949. Mao wrote much less than Lenin and is best known for his Little Red Book, a brief collection of his quotations. Where Lenin wrote volumes, Mao wrote one-liners. On the other hand, while Lenin ruled Russia for just over 6 years, Mao ruled China for over 26 years. In both countries, once the Civil War was over, the first thing the new governments did was indeed to abolish private property, just as in Marx's program. However, they did not replace it with socialized property, but with state property. everything came to belong to the state. Supposedly, the state was the representative of society as a whole. But in practice, the state was run by the Communist Party. This meant that the party controlled both politics and the economy, and so became a new ruling class. Communist societies did not turn out to be the societies of equality and justice that Marx hoped for, but instead became often brutal dictatorships. However, the Soviet Union has already collapsed, although not because it was a brutal dictatorship. The Soviet Union collapsed because of something else Marx said. He said that every mode of production will last just as long as it can continue to develop the economy and, in particular, advance the forces of production, especially technology. This is why Marx was wrong in thinking that capitalism would collapse any day now, because capitalism is clearly still advancing technology. Practically every day there's some new gadget on the shelves. Someday, capitalism will run out of ideas, and then it'll collapse. But that's not going to happen in our lifetimes. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, ran out of ideas very quickly. This is because the state is only good at carrying through specific, large-scale projects. Stalin was able to industrialize Russia within a decade of taking over, although he did it largely by buying or copying Western technology. But government bureaucrats have no incentive to introduce ongoing innovation. On the contrary, anything new just screws up their administrative routines and makes more work for them without any reward. So the Soviet Union saw very little technological innovation, and Russia started falling further and further behind the West. Lacking the incentive provided by the market, communism turned out not to be a dynamic mode of production like capitalism in Marx's terms. The West saw the computer revolution, the telecommunications revolution, the internet and globalization, and Russia was getting left out. So, communism was overthrown, and Russia is now a capitalist country. China is also integrating with the West, and I'm sure that it will soon also become fully capitalist. Capitalism is becoming a truly global mode of production. I would argue that the problem with Marx's predictions was simply that he wanted to see them come true. He wanted it all to happen in his lifetime. So he came up with this historical shortcut. We'll have one big revolution, and then everything will be perfect. Well, unfortunately, history doesn't work that way. History shows us that society takes hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years to make major changes. So, I agree with Marx's predictions. I just think he got his timescale wrong. I think that historically, social inequality follows the bell curve. We began with very low levels of inequality in hunting and gathering society. Then inequality rose until it peaked with the institutions of mass slavery and divine monarchy. And inequality has been diminishing slowly ever since. So I do believe that eventually we will arrive at Marx's society of equality, his advanced communism. I just think that it's still hundreds of years away. But after Marx's death in 1883, it seemed like his predictions were coming true very quickly, with the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Marxism seemed to be the way of the future, and so it came to dominate European sociology, and it became the official ideology of the Soviet Union and Communist China. However, as the Soviet Communist Party became a new ruling class, they twisted Marx's words to justify their rule. Marx himself, I have no doubt, would never have approved of the brutal dictatorship that the Soviet Union became. But the Communist Party developed a variety of Marxism or materialism, which they termed dialectical materialism, or for short, diamat. The term dialectical is one that Marx used, and it simply means that everything is two-way. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We can't have one without the other. But diamat became a sort of private language with hidden meanings that only the top party officials really understood. It became a way of keeping the working class in the dark about what the government was really doing. In other words, Marxism was turned into the very thing that Marx spent his whole life fighting against. It became a ruling ideology. However, as the official ideology of these large and powerful nations, first Russia, then China, the basic ideas of Marxism became globally known and were for a time very influential, especially among the world's poorer nations. In Western Europe, Marx's ideas have been taken in two main directions. Some theorists have followed Marx in focusing on the economy, the material or objective side of society, while others have sought to round out his work by focusing on culture, the subjective side of society. The first approach to emerge was eventually called economic determinism. This approach followed Marx in arguing that the economy determines the course of history, and therefore that the contradictions of capitalism would inevitably lead to revolution, as Marx predicted. The economic determinists appeared triumphant with the victory of the Russian Revolution, but their popularity faded as the problems of Soviet communism became increasingly apparent, and mainland Europe embraced fascism rather than communism. Instead, we saw the rise of a school of thought that became known as Hegelian Marxism because, like Hegel, it focused more on the subjective side of society than Marx had. In the 1920s, Hungarian George Lukács expanded on Marx's concept of class consciousness, and in the 30s, Italian Antonio Gramsci expanded Marx's concept of the ruling ideology into the concept of hegemony to explain how the ruling class maintained their cultural leadership of society. But the biggest development took place in Germany. 1923 saw the founding of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, basically a Marxist think tank. The Institute developed Marx's ideas, focusing more on culture and creating what's been termed cultural Marxism. Unfortunately for them, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and the only people that Hitler hated more than communists were Jews, and many members of the Institute were Jewish. So most of them fled to the US. Some, like Walter Benjamin, stayed, saying that someone has to stay and fight this evil. This was brave, but foolish. Benjamin was put into a Nazi concentration camp, where he died. Those who came to the US quickly found that Marxism was pretty much a dirty word there. So they changed the name of their theory to critical theory, but this is just Marxism under another name. One of the goals of the Frankfurt School, as they were known, was to integrate the work of Sigmund Freud into Marxism. Based on Freudian psychoanalysis, Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, and others developed the concept of the authoritarian personality. They sought to explain the Nazis' swift rise to power and proposed that one reason was that many people had a psychological need for strict authority to provide their lives with stability. Those with an authoritarian personality provided their superiors with unquestioning obedience and expected the same from their subordinates. The authoritarianism and strong convictions of fascism appealed to such persons. The Frankfurt School also credited the Nazis' rise to power to their skillful use of the modern electronic media, and then extended this analysis to the post-war US. Adorno, in particular, worked with Max Horkheimer to provide a critique of what they called the culture industry, these days called the entertainment industry, or just Hollywood. They argued that the rise of the electronic media, including radio, TV, and movies, had allowed the ruling ideology to become more subtle, more all-pervasive, and so more effective than ever before. They also contributed to the rise of the environmental movement with their critique of what they termed the domination of nature. They argued that modern industrial capitalism dominates and exploits nature, just as it dominates and exploits people. Despite the work of the critical theorists, Marxism was at first slow to catch on in the US. In the 1950s, the only American sociologist putting forward ideas similar to those of Marx was C. Wright Mills. Mills had not read Marx at that time, but he independently developed concepts which covered much the same ground as Marx, but he put them in his own terminology. For example, what Marx called the ruling class, Mills called the power elite. He also updated Marx's class analysis with his work on the rise of the new white-collar middle class in the US. In 1959, he published The Sociological Imagination. This text was intended to demonstrate the connection between the individual and society, and to introduce the average person to sociological thought. It has become his most popular and influential book. The ideas of critical theory and Marxism in general really broke through in North America in the 1960s. The 60s and early 70s was the only period in North American history when the left was in a politically dominant position. This was largely due to the post-war expansion in higher education, which created a generation of young, educated people questioning the system and creating a counterculture which contained some elements of Marxism. As a result, the 60s were the heyday of Marxism in the West. In Germany, most of the Frankfurt School returned after the end of the war and re-established the institute, leading to the rise of a second generation of critical theorists. The foremost of these was Jürgen Habermas, who rose in prominence from the 60s to the 80s. Habermas took cultural Marxism in an increasingly subjectivist direction, coming to focus on communication and communicative reason. He concluded that social relations like those of class and power distort communication, and that true communication is only possible between equals. Truth is what would be agreed upon in what Habermas called the ideal speech situation, where there are no social constraints on communication. In France, the 60s also saw the rise of structural Marxism, led by Louis Althusser. Althusser's best-known book is For Marx, published in 1965. As the title implies, he took a basically Marxist position, but integrated elements of structuralism into it. In particular, while he agreed with Marx that the economy was always the most important aspect of society, he argued that other aspects were not just determined by the economy, but that each social structure had what he called relative autonomy from the economy. In the 70s, this evolved into a debate within Marxism concerning the relative autonomy of the state. In this debate, the structural Marxists were represented by Althusser's most well-known follower, the Greek Frenchman Nikos Poulantzas. On the other side were instrumentalist Marxists, represented by the Englishman Ralph Miliband. Both agreed that the state in capitalism primarily serves the interests of the capitalist class, but Poulantzas argued that this was because state and capital were so intertwined that the state was structurally bound to help capital. Miliband instead argued that it was because of the personal ties between capitalists and politicians, and that the state could potentially do much more to help the working class. Eventually, it was recognized that Poulantzas' approach was valid at the macro level, and Miliband's was valid at the micro level, and that their theories were more complementary than contradictory. In addition, this classic debate between thesis and antithesis led to the rise of a theoretical synthesis, termed class conflict theory. This approach argued that the state, like all social structures, was a battleground for class conflict. Both classes attempted to influence state policy, and while the capitalists won a majority of the time, they did not win all the time. There are many laws and social programs that exist only because the working class fought for them, and Marxists should be the last to dismiss the importance of that accomplishment. The 70s also saw a renewed focus on the economy and the labor process, most notably in the work of American Harry Braverman and Englishman Michael Burawoy. Both argued that the modern industrial production process is ideological because it instills habits of obedience to the capitalist into the workforce. Every time the boss gives an order which the workers obey, he is reinforcing capitalist ideology. So, as they operate, businesses and factories not only manufacture products, they also, as Burawoy put it, manufacture consent. The consent of the working class to be ruled by the capitalist class. The 70s also saw American Emanuel Wallerstein publish the first volume of The Modern World System. Wallerstein provided a revised version of Marx's historical model. He argued that in the course of history, there have only been two types of international world systems. The first was the world empire, such as that of ancient Rome. The second is the modern capitalist world economy. Empires are based on political and military domination. Capitalism is based on economic domination. Wallerstein argued that capitalism has created an international structure which mirrors its internal class structure. That is to say, there is an upper, middle, and lower class of countries, which Wallerstein called the core, periphery, and semi-periphery. The core consists of the rich countries of the West. The periphery consists of the poor countries of the Third World, especially Africa and Latin America. And in between is the semi-periphery, which consists of poorer Western countries, such as Spain and Portugal, and richer Third World countries, such as Brazil and Nigeria. This model has become widely known, and much has been written analysing the global economy in terms of core-periphery relations. The late 70s and early 80s also saw the rise of analytical Marxism. Its goal was to strip away the dogma and ideological thinking which had grown up around Marxism and to redefine it in terms of strict scientific methods and facts. Probably its best-known theorist was American Eric Olin Wright, who argued that the class structure of capitalism had grown much more complex since Marx's day, and so he updated Marx by providing a more sophisticated model of modern classes. Analytical Marxism explicitly adopted elements of functionalism in its arguments, but was criticized by other Marxists for also adopting functionalism's political conservatism. The 80s also saw the rise of post-modernist Marxism. Theorists like Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe accepted postmodernism's focus on the subjective over Marx's focus on the objective, and examined things like language, text, and discourse rather than class structure and class struggle. This woke Marxism focuses on minority rights and radical democracy rather than the struggle of the working class against the ruling class. Personally, as far as I'm concerned, postmodernist Marxism is what in Poland they call fried snowballs. It's a contradiction in terms. Postmodernism is a subjectivist theory, not a materialist one. Marx named his theory materialism to emphasize his opposition to idealism, which was the postmodernism of his day, the leading subjectivist theory. If you are an idealist, then you are not a materialist. And if you're a postmodernist, then you're not a Marxist. The only connection between the two theories is that they are both critical of the status quo, but for very different reasons. 1991 saw the sudden and dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union. Marxism essentially lost all global credibility virtually overnight. In 1995, Ronald Aronson, while still identifying himself as a Marxist, declared that Marxism was dead. He argued that Marxism had always been both a theory and a social movement, and that the social movement had failed. Its twin goals of the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and its replacement by a more just socialist society had both been discredited. In this, Aronson is undoubtedly correct. However, this does not mean that Marxism cannot contribute to new social movements. In particular, Marxism has contributed to the rise of the anti-globalization movement. This included the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Wherever movement in 2011, an idea that was originally proposed by the Canadian organization Adbusters Media Foundation. The main slogan of the Occupy movement was, "We are the 99%. And the main idea being put across here was that right now, we live in a world where the richest 1% are rapidly getting much richer, while the other 99% of the world's population are either seeing minimal income growth or are experiencing a dramatic decline in their income. 99% of the world's population are either seeing minimal income growth or are either seeing dramatic decline in their income. 99% of the world's population are either seeing minimal income growth or are either seeing dramatic decline in their income. or are actually getting poorer. In other words, the gap between the top 1%, who make up the global ruling class, and the other 99% is growing swiftly, and the 99% have had enough of it. The figures support the Occupy movement. Today, millionaire households make up about 1% of the world's population, but own over a third of the world's wealth. There are about 1,500 billionaires in the world who together own over $5 trillion. Meanwhile, over 3 billion people have incomes of under $2.50 a day. In Canada today, the top 100 CEOs make an average income of over $10 million a year, which is over 400 times the national average income. Meanwhile, the average Canadian household is now over $100,000 in debt, and over 4 million Canadians live below the poverty line. All of this means, unfortunately, that Marx's model of a world divided into a small, rich, powerful, capitalist ruling class and a large, poor, powerless working class is, if anything, even more true today than when Marx wrote it in the 19th century. And this is why, although Marxism has declined in the public consciousness, it remains probably the dominant theoretical perspective in sociology worldwide, with the possible exception of the US. Because the US has the world's richest and most powerful capitalist class, it also has the most powerful ruling ideology, and so has the most right-wing culture in the world, including the most right-wing sociology. But, by contrast, most Canadian sociologists today probably adhere to some combination of Marxism and feminism, and globally, sociologists are perhaps the most leftist occupation of all. Rightists argue that this is because of their so-called liberal bias. However, I would argue that if those whose job it is to study society generally hold leftist views, it's because the facts that they have learned through their years of study support those views. That concludes what I have to say on the history of Marxism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day.